Hello, my name is Yasser Suleiman, and I'm one of the 6 members of our group that helped write our report on the Mexican energy reform. The other 5 include Lawrence Babst, Arcel Baden, Morgan Heffler, Anthony Corona, and Alex Roscagno. Today we will be going over the history of oil and gas in Mexico, what has changed in the sector for the need of a reform, where are we now with a constitutional reform, and what's next for Mexico's future. Mexico struck oil in 1901 and became the second largest oil producer by 1921. With great money came great irresponsibility. Mexican workers were being taken advantage of, being paid only a portion of their international counterparts. The action to nationalize oil was taken by then-President Lorenzo Cardenas when foreign oil companies operating in Mexico chose to defy a Mexican Supreme Court decision that came after decades of bitter labor disputes and strikes. The history behind the nationalization of the Mexican oil industry has been taught to every generation of Mexico's school children since the 1930s, as a story of great national pride and liberation from American imperialism. As such, the action has almost as sentimental a place in Mexico's national mindset as the Mexican Revolution, and thus always becomes a very steep hill for the Mexican policymakers to overcome. Mexico peaked in 2004 when 3.5 million barrels per day, and since then decreased by 1 million barrels per day in the past 8 years, which is a huge concern for Mexico, done so in a time where Mexico has more than tripled their investment in exploration and extraction in oil and gas. So Mexico put money into the fields but came out short in the oil production. In 1997, Mexico was consuming as much natural gas as they were producing. Now, 15 years later, Mexico is consuming more than they're producing, so they receive a third of their consumption of natural gas from the US. Despite having an enormous quantity of natural gas underneath the Mexican soil, they have the irony of not being able to produce as much as Mexico should, which causes importation. Mexico not only has high importation of natural gas, but has even a higher importation of gasoline and even a higher percentage of importation of petrochemicals. Despite being a strong producer of oil and having important refineries in the country, Mexico hasn't been able to keep the pace with the growth of the Mexican economy, so most is imported from the US. Since 1960, the oil and gas model embedded in Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution was amended. The reform that occurred in 1960 was actually made to close the oil and gas sector even more to private participation. So this is a really transformative reform that President Peña has put through Mexican Congress. Now oil and gas reserves are now going to be administered by the Mexican state through the Ministry of Energy rather than Pemex. The amendment now changes the game for exploration and extraction, refinery, and petrochemistry. Exploration and extraction will now be done through contracts where it was previously prohibited to do so with the previous constitution. Article 27 was amended to allow contracts which are common in the global market. Kinds of contracts include service contracts, profit-sharing contracts, production-sharing contracts, and licenses. Before this, Mexico and Kuwait were the only 2 countries to provide service contracts in the world and nothing else. Refinery and petrochemistry were also once closed to private participation, but now thanks to the amendment of Article 27 is now open to private participation. Now private companies can participate in refineries and petrochemicals with Mexican or foreign companies, associated between foreign companies or associated between Pemex. Pemex can also participate in these sectors, but will not be the only participator, which has been up until now in the Constitution. Through the transitory articles of the constitutional reform, Congress has established a path which allows Pemex up to 90 days after the amendment has been published by the President to present the Ministry of Energy those areas in the country where they want to keep on working. The Ministry of Energy then has 180 days after those previous 90 days to decide that. This is called Round Zero. This allows Pemex to have enough reserves that gives it sustainability in the medium and long term, while giving the market sufficient resources to develop through the private sector. Money from the contracts goes to the Mexican Petroleum Fund for Stabilization and Development that is going to base in the central bank. The idea of this fund is that the money comes through the Mexican oil reform goes mostly to long-term projects. So Mexico establishes a base for the budget which will allow Mexico to not have any hiccups. But at the same time, most importantly of that is that Mexico is betting on the future of the country.
First, Mexico is going to make the betting grounds and guidelines will be made public so anybody can see it. Second, transparency clauses will be included in all oil and gas contracts. That way, the citizens of Mexico and the world can check it out online or ask for those through the Transparency Institution. Third, there will be full disclosure of all payment associated to oil and gas contracts. And fourth, external audits, cost recovery, and Mexico's accounting aspects are going to be transparent. At the constitutional level, Mexico is establishing 4 elements of best practices for transparency.
2 of the transitory articles in the constitutional reform establish responsibility of the Mexican state to come up with a transition plan, which will be the responsibility of the Ministry of Energy to implement. Mexico sees natural gas as a very important transitory energy. Mexico has strong reserves of Mexican gas, but still imports 1/3 of what they're consuming. This means that Mexico will burn more natural gas than diesel, which is more polluting. But even more importantly, it costs Mexico 4 to 6 times more than it would be costing to burn natural gas.
The reform will cause the natural gas to be cheaper, meaning Mexico will burn less costly diesel for electricity. This will automatically benefit the families of Mexico with much cheaper electricity. Cheaper gas allows for farmers to buy more fertilizer for less, in turn allowing crops to be fruitful and plentiful to all Mexican families. Over 3.5 million jobs are predicted to be created over the next decade. This will encourage the Mexican youth that Mexico will have a promising future for them.
In conclusion, Mexican citizens hold pride in their national oil, but with rough economic times, even the biggest nationalists would be ready to stop and listen to a reasonable reform. The constitutional reform privatizes the oil and gas sector of Mexico. Transparency helps keep the oil and gas sector less corrupt. More natural gas means cheaper electricity and cheaper foods. Even though there will be many benefits, most will come in the long term. Mexican families have to be patient with the government and allow time for the reform to take full effect over the next several years.